Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We are going to talk today about impact comparison. And I have a few top level thoughts before we talk about improving your impact debating. My first thought is you should always be thinking about impact, this part of the debate, as a comparison. I really hate the term impact calculus for two reasons. One, it's not calculus. It is not algebra. It is not arithmetic. It is not math. It is an assessment of whose impact is scarier. And second, I think that that term impact calculus distracts from the ways in which you should be always making comparisons. I think that people are pretty good at saying our impact is really big, or our impact happens really fast, or our impact is very likely, but really bad at comparing that to the other team's impact. You should always be thinking about why your impact is scarier than, not just scary, but scarier in relation to the other team's set of impacts. And part of this is assuming that each team is winning similar risks of your respective offense. So you want to do this part of the debate without thinking about why you're reducing the likelihood of the other team's impact in other ways. So sometimes people say things like, the dissent outweighs the case because the AF doesn't reduce enough emissions to solve warming, or like the critique outweighs the case because Russian cyber attacks won't escalate. That is not helpful because it begs the question of whether you're winning that particular case defense. So you want to think about the impact debate a little bit more as a tiebreaker in a world where you're both winning similar degrees of your primary offense, and how the judge should resolve the debate in that scenario. The second thought I have is that final rebuttal impact assessment can and should account for more of what's happening in the debate writ large. So if uniqueness is conceded, or there's no impact defense to a particular impact, things like that, that can be accounted for and incorporated into your impact assessment, but it should not be the primary filter or the primary focus for our impact is scarier than the other team's impact. Third is you want to think lower on the internal link chain than the very terminal part, the very end point of a particular impact, by which I mean something like nuclear war versus environmental collapse in the abstract is less useful than comparing something like US-Russia conflict versus Japanese proliferation. The most extreme versions of an impact are the least likely, and you don't want to have to win that an actual nuclear war breaks out to win that your impact outweighs the affirmatives, or vice versa. And last kind of top level thought is to spend time thinking about comparisons, big picture comparisons like economic decline versus global warming, or structural violence versus hegemony, or things like that. There are a number of types of comparisons that you'll make routinely, and it will become obvious early in the topic what those are. And once you know what the types of comparisons are that you're making routinely, you should start writing out impact comparisons so that you have an idea of what you're working with. You have an idea of what some of the best arguments are for why one impact is scarier than the other. And writing those out, even if you never read that overview or that explanation in a debate, gets your gears grinding in thinking about why those things are true, or what might be compelling to a judge about why one impact is scarier than another. And so I highly recommend doing that as just an exercise for yourself, even if you never read it in a debate. So I want to give you an example of a common impact overview that you might hear in a debate. Economic decline outweighs and turns the case on probability. It erodes trade connections, which lessens the opportunity cost of conflict. It promotes domestic crisis, which incentivizes leaders to produce rally around the flag effects through diversionary military action. When leaders initiate a crisis, there's inherent risk of escalatory spirals driven by miscalculations causing nuclear war. Outweighs on magnitude because you can only die once, and time frame because impacts are triggered by the mere perception of an impending decline. So that sounds reasonable. I think that impact overview sounds like it's making the set of arguments that you might want to be making in a debate. Who can tell me what you think is maybe missing from that impact overview?
It doesn't do very much incorporation of the other team's impact.
Excellent. Yeah. So it doesn't allude to it alludes to the idea that the other team has an impact, but it doesn't compare the two in any meaningful way. Excellent. So with respect to helping your judge decide the debate, it only minimally moves the needle. It tells the judge what your impact is and gets a start on answering defense, but nothing more. It sort of pretends to do a comparison by saying the word outweighs, but it doesn't do any actual comparison. And you can tell because if there was a comparison, there would be talk about what the other side has said and why it is worse. And so giving kind of a canned overview like that, you're giving up an opportunity to do something that is more useful. Let's talk more about why this is a problem and how we can do impact debating better. Basically speaking, or essentially speaking, it is a problem because you need to be accounting for what the other side has said, and you need to be giving your judge some metric for comparison, some basis for, okay, I have considered the possibility of these two impacts and have decided that one is worse for the following reasons, in order for them to decide to vote for one impact over the other. The next thing I want to talk about is the sort of standard checklist that you're taught when you're like a novice. So you're presumably familiar with the checklist of magnitude, probability, and time frame. And what I want you to do is to stop thinking about this checklist altogether. I mean that in a couple of senses. First, I want you to get rid of the buzzwords as much as possible. The less you use any of the three words magnitude, probability, time frame, the more detailed your debating will necessarily be, because you'll be forced to be making actual arguments instead of just inserting the word or the label magnitude, probability, time frame and pretending that it makes an argument. Second, I want you to stop thinking about this as a checklist. You want to be making a set of comparisons or choices between impacts that the judge can vote to avoid, rather than we are worse on this level and this level and this level. So it is not a checklist. It should not be considered that way. And I want you to stop thinking about it that way. One way of avoiding the checklist of doom is to select which aspect your impact is strongest on and make it matter the most. Make the judge care about that aspect above all else. So is your impact very quick? Make the judge care about the speed at which something could happen above all else. Is your impact particularly likely? Plant that seed and progressively convince the judge to care about that above all else. Is your impact particularly large? Make your judge care about the magnitude, except you're not going to say the word magnitude. Make your judge care about how large an impact is above all else. Oh yeah, here's LJ setting up the owl. That'll be so good. Okay, so we're going to talk about better impacts, a better way of thinking about impact description. So one standard that you've probably heard, or way of thinking about the total cost of an impact, is risk equals probability times magnitude. Have we all heard, are we all familiar with that kind of, formulation for the severity of an impact?
Not really, to be honest.
Fair enough. Well, who has heard that formulation before? Yes, Kaveen and Hercules have. What does it mean? What do people mean when they say that? Someone who has heard that before.
It means that the risk of it happening plus the severity of it makes it so that a judge can evaluate one more than the other.
Okay, yeah, more or less. I would slightly alter what you're saying and say that it's really the risk, or risk is the probability or the likelihood multiplied by the magnitude. So instead of added together, it's like kind of combined or multiplied by each other. So in thinking about that concept, that is a helpful way to analyze risks, but it's pretty abstract and it's too connected to impact defense to be helpful in comparing them, right? Because if you're deciding the probability times the magnitude, you're having to assess like, okay, well, what do I think is the likelihood of that impact in order to get to probability? And so that is necessarily connected to impact defense in a way that is not actually helpful. Does that kind of make sense to people? Excellent. So let's assume that an actual debate is occurring. Everyone's impacts are mitigated to some degree. No one has dropped anything. And there is approximate parity between the quality of the impact and the impact defense that has been read. I want to introduce the following components that can help move the needle in this situation. I'm going to use I'm really mixing technologies here, but I'm going to use the Zoom whiteboard. If I can do that. Maybe it won't let me. Okay, let's see if this works. Nope, okay, this is really stupid, sorry.
Sorry, is the audio coming out of one of your computers or the?
No.
Okay.
Mine's it's not like you have an Apple. I just turn mine off and then use that audio.
Okay, that would be good. Sorry, we're late in figuring this out.
All good.
Mute on that.
Yeah.
Okay. So while I was futzing around with the whiteboard and it didn't work, we were futzing around with the audio. So we're really killing it on the tech front today. So the components that I want you to be thinking about instead of risk equals probability times magnitude are reasonable core times uncertainty multiplier times worst case multiplier. So that is a set of terms that you have likely never heard before that I think will help your impact debating if we think about what they mean. So first, the reasonable core. Every impact, even the dumbest impacts, can be massaged into a not stupid related premise. And you want to start with the reasonable version. Doing this first shuts down a presumption ballot because it gets to a probable version, it gets a probable version of your impact off the ground and establishes that some version of what you've said corresponds to the judge's experience of reality. You are looking for language that would not sound out of place in a congressional hearing that involves serious qualified people. So for example, one species going extinct or the core of a biodiversity impact might not kill everyone, but the theory behind biodiversity has reasonable concepts like keystone species and ecological interdependencies. Another example, disease impacts killing everyone seems implausible at face value, but disease creating broad-based disruption to society and killing tens of millions of people is within our range of literal lived experience. Like we have seen that happen, or we have seen a version of that that has killed many, many people and created broad societal disruption. Or economic decline causing nuclear war, that seems sort of implausible at face value, but economic decline contributing to radicalization, social dislocation, populism, and nationalism seems much more likely, right? Like all of these things are basic premises that have at their core something reasonable. AI might not turn into a computer god that enslaves humanity, but it might result in social disruption as it displaces workers or make military hardware more dangerous or unpredictable as its integration into combat increases. So in each of those examples, I've taken something that has the premise that you've heard in a debate, like the nuclear war, the extinction, the total collapse of society version of the impact, and I've taken the reasonable kernel within that premise that is actually on face plausible and reasonable and can be sort of integrated into our knowledge and fits with our experiences of reality, right? So before going further, it's worth thinking about the fact that while this reasonable core may not rise to the level of extinction, it is still a high probability, high magnitude impact that can outweigh what your opponent has said by itself, right? So if you think about the very basic premises of your impact argument, they probably have the possibility of outweighing what your opponent has said once all is said and done, and once you've incorporated everything that has happened in the debate into a discussion of why that impact is really scary. So, you know, none of those examples that I just cited necessarily causes extinction or like total lights out for the human race, but all of them probably cause some pretty bad things to happen, right? Does that seem sort of reasonable? So that is the reasonable core premise that I want you to think about when debating impacts. Your impact debating should account for what are the basic premises that are actually plausible, that are extremely reasonable, that are still really, really bad if they were to happen. Is that making sense to people so far? Cool. Next is the uncertainty multiplier. So the question I want you to ask yourself is, how sure are you about the range of possible outcomes of letting the impact happen? And at an even more meta level, how sure is it conceivably possible to be? When you have a very silly impact, you want the uncertainty to be as large as possible. You want to be telling the judge that voting for impact defense is ultimately rolling the dice. The judge is gambling that the impact won't be as bad as you say based on the information they are provided in the debate. You want to make this gamble, this kind of dice roll, very explicit. So we'll stick with artificial intelligence since it'll be a common impact on this topic. To vote negative on AI impact defense, a judge must evaluate the sum of technical and political science evidence and arguments that are presented by a variety of cards and experts and conclude that the risks of AI are overstated. So they have to decide, okay, I've listened to all of what's been said and I've decided that the risks inherent within artificial intelligence have been overblown. They are not scary. You want to make a fundamental epistemological challenge to the judge and to the impact defense author's ability to do this, to the very concept or premise that they are gambling with. So whatever else you might think about AI, and I'm sure you have many thoughts about AI as a concept, it is genuinely a transformative technology, right? It interfaces with the internet and with the military, which are two of the most powerful forces in society, the internet and the military. It's hard to think of two more powerful concepts, and allows them to make decisions at a rate and at a level of autonomy that is unparalleled and unprecedented in human history, right? So it takes the military and the internet and says, all right, the level of decision-making and autonomy that you get over basic everyday decisions is unprecedented, has never happened before in human history. And it also has the ability or the potential to recursively improve, since AI can support inventive processes that give or yield new generations of itself. So the result could be an explosion of technological growth that unfetters humans and allows us to achieve things that previous generations could only dream about. So I think, what the concept that you want your judge to take away is that totally lost my train of thought. It is the height of hubris to assume that anyone from their vantage point in the current moment can definitively say how this will go, especially if the reasoning is based on technological constraints. So if you think about asking someone in 1980 to predict the effects of the internet, they could certainly not tell you about the iPhone. They could certainly not tell you about about our ability to and constant practice of Zooming with each other constantly day to day. They certainly could not tell you about any of the myriad ways that the internet has both improved and changed our lives. So when we talk about artificial intelligence, we're doing something very similar where we're saying, I have a high degree of confidence that far in the future, I know what the effects of this basically unparalleled technology will be. So the idea that one can be very confident about the net effects of that technology is totally laughable and absolutely ridiculous. And that is the kind of concept that you want your judge to be taking into account. So the uncertainty multiplier means that you need your judge to be thinking about, what am I not certain about? What am I unclear or uncertain about regarding the effects of this particular impact? And why do those call for a high degree of caution or call for a high degree of skepticism or optimism or whatever it is that you want your judge to take away? you know, the uncertainty multiplier is about making explicit those things and giving them to your judge as in a package to help them take away, okay, I need to be really, really certain about what I think about these to vote against this impact. Is that all making sense? Questions so far about either the reasonable core or the uncertainty multiplier? Okay, so third is the worst case multiplier. You have set it up such that to let your impact happen is at best a gamble. So now you want to set the stakes of that gamble. You want to assume your reasonable core metastasizes and takes on its most destructive form. You might have heard of this as the tail end risk in discussions of climate change. So how bad can it really get? What are the tail end risks of this impact? So let's assume that AI has suffered a control failure. Remember from earlier, the exact probability of this happening is unknown and unknowable. It is surely not zero. An out of control AI can wreak all sorts of havoc. Its interests might be misaligned with humans, causing it to derail society in subtle and unpredictable ways. It may even view humans as an impediment, causing it to work against our interests and even directly damage us. So in the context of world-threatening technologies like nuclear weapons, something as simple as a bug or like a programming error could cause dangerous weapons to be used, which again threatens humanity. Like genuinely, a programming error or a bug in the nuclear weapons code could actually threaten humanity, causing nuclear weapons to be unleashed. So all of this combination gets at the same issues as what probability times magnitude is attempting to do, but it's in a manner that is more helpful to a judge performing evaluations. It doesn't just answer impact defense, although it does do that. It builds a framework for how a judge should evaluate impact defense in the first place, for how judges should be thinking about what that impact defense means. Now I want to talk about comparisons. Oh, good, I can sort of see some of you. Hooray. Hi, everyone. Oh, no, back to the chalkboard. Oh, well. Okay, so far, none of this is a comparison. We still don't know how any of these criteria relate to our opponent's impacts. So how do you do that? In short, the answer is use your brain noodle. You got to explain why your advantage matters more than what the other side has said, the same way you would to just a generic, actual smart person. Pretend you're talking to or writing for your social studies teacher or writing a letter to your congressman, and think about what would I want to tell that person. If I were putting together an essay about the risks of this impact and I were communicating that information to someone who I think is pretty smart, who understands a little bit about the world, what do I want that person to take away? What do I want that person to know that is really important? So we'll get into a few factors that you can use that gel with our refined impact explanation and might register more to a normal person. And remember, this is still not to be seen as a checklist. You should be using comparisons that make sense in each context. So not a checklist, set of ways to compare, and you want to be using those ways to compare in context in each debate. The list is also not exclusive. You should obviously feel free to come up with your own comparisons if these are a poor fit for your impact argument. The key is to the bottom line, the takeaway is to provide specific direction to a judge. It is judge instruction beyond just saying magnitude or probability. So some factors that can be sort of tiebreakers or useful metrics in impact debating. First, rationality. So most people agree that it is the default tendency of humans to try to avoid self-destruction. That is kind of the core of what rationality means. We try to avoid our own demise. The international relations theory of realism says that this premise also applies to heads of state, and that heads of state translate this premise to avoiding national self-destruction as well. These assumptions make it extremely improbable at a baseline that certain types of extinction events will occur. So with a few debatable exceptions, there has not been a conflict in which great powers fight one another directly since World War II. There have certainly been close calls, but a common thread that connects those close calls has been that extreme care has been taken by participating leaders to avoid the worst case scenario. So for example, Kennedy and Khrushchev both made massive concessions out of fear of nuclear escalation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Who knows what I'm talking about when I say Cuban Missile Crisis? You can talk out loud and the owl will point to you, hopefully, but you have to shout it real loud. Okay, someone shout real loud what the Cuban Missile Crisis was.
Okay. Was there volume? So basically, I think I might be wrong and confusing this with someone else, but there were only really intermediate sort of range missiles. So the US went over to their ally Turkey and was like, let's put missiles in Turkey. And then Russia was like, oh no, you now have missiles that can hit us. And that's really bad. So we want missiles that can hit you. So then they sent missiles over to Cuba that could hit the US. And then it was like, they were about to like launch missiles like over a mistake at the US and start World War III. But then this one Russian guy who was like the second in command or something didn't launch the missiles. So then he like stopped World War III from happening. So it was basically everyone was like scared that the other was going to attack them.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think that's excellent work. That I think a little bit conflates a later like accidental scare with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but very good. So Kennedy, as described in that description, the Kennedy and Khrushchev were both very scared of nuclear escalation and made enormous concessions to avoid nuclear escalation that seemed highly plausible in that context. Very good. So another case in point would be the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So debaters have often read Russia war impacts in which it was simply assumed that any conflict because of miscalculation or the fog of war or escalation spirals would go nuclear. But experience, including very recent direct experience, has shown that leaders in NATO and Russia have painstakingly avoided taking steps that would cross the other side's escalatory red lines, and a broader war has been avoided. So does anyone know about the debate over the no-fly zone? Someone again, just shout real loud.
Isn't it basically that to establish a no-fly zone, you have to like have planes or missiles and stuff to like take down Russian airplanes or missiles that would like be flying over Ukraine? But the problem is if the US or Poland set up a no-fly zone, then they would have their airplanes and missiles flying over Ukraine. And then if Russia hit one of them, then that would prompt the Article 5 defense of NATO. So then NATO would declare war against Russia, which would mean like the US and a bunch of European countries would be at war against Russia, which would be like another way to start World War III.
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. So it has been a very deliberate decision by the US and NATO not to establish a no-fly zone for exactly the reasons that have just been cited, because it would be extremely escalatory and extremely likely to trigger an event or to cause an event that would trigger Article 5 that would directly draw us into direct conflict between the US and Russia. And so those steps that have been taken, or the deliberate sort of de-escalation has been very deliberate in order to avoid a broader war. So these are all examples of rationality that prevent nuclear conflict from occurring. And other kinds of threats can be subject to a similar analysis. So nuclear technology is all designed with fail-safes, and tens of thousands of people have dedicated their entire lives to ensuring that existential accidents do not occur. A similar idea holds for blackouts and critical infrastructure systems, right? So that a single outage or meltdown does not trigger a broader escalation spiral. The upshot is that wars, especially between great powers and especially involving the use of nuclear weapons, as well as existential catastrophes that require leaders to actively choose self-destruction, or an extremely large number of experts to have a simultaneous critical lapse in judgment, are unlikely to occur. They're extremely unlikely. However, by contrast, impacts that are the product of a coordination or collective action problem, wherein no single set of individuals can veto the impact from happening or is motivated to do so, or impacts that are not the product of human decisions, all potentially, if packaged and sold a certain way, can have a higher likelihood of reaching their worst possible form, right? So those impacts can be said to have a higher uncertainty modifier because there is no human rationality at play that can deliberately choose to de-escalate. So this would suggest that one should be more concerned about harms that stem from the environment or from rogue actors deploying disproportionately powerful technologies than from rational heads of state taking steps that will result in self-annihilation. So hopefully you can think of some impact comparisons or some impacts that this directly applies to. Next is history. So that's kind of all under the rationality header. Next is history. What does history tell us about our impacts? This is really important and it can go in multiple different directions. Some impacts have enough similarities to events that have taken place before that history should make us more concerned about them. But in other cases, historical precedent might reveal that concerns are overblown and we should be less concerned about that. Either way, history can be very useful to invoke. The world is very complicated. It is very difficult to make predictions about things. We can get a better sense of what things will be like in the future if those things or close analogs to them have happened before. We should cast a critical eye on theories of threat that presume a fundamental departure from the way similar situations have played out in the past. And again, that can go either way. It can either be, similar situations in the past have been really, really bad. We can name a number of disease pandemics that have been really terrible, or it can go towards, a more sanguine approach, that we've seen economic decline that has not spurred massive, escalation, massive nuclear escalation or, nuclear conflict of any kind. And we should be cognizant of those examples and be invoking them in both directions. There is also value in pointing out when an event is unprecedented in history. So if one side's impact has happened before and the other's hasn't, the impact that hasn't happened before benefits from a larger uncertainty multiplier. So if it is an unprecedented style impact, something that has never happened before, it's sort of double-sided because, well, we have no historical analog to say that this might happen. We have no basis or precedent for saying this is likely to happen. But the flip side of that is we have a larger uncertainty multiplier for if it did happen, we have a lot of uncertainty about what that would be like. And so that it can be very scary. So again, historical analogs should be invoked in both directions where they help you either package your impact as more scary or package the other team's impact as less scary. Next is the threat generator or threat multiplier or generator function. So there is an existential risk scholar that most people don't read named Daniel Schmattenberger. He is a founding member of the Consilience Project, which aims to elevate the discourse around existential risk. Schmattenberger suggests that we should think about existential risk using the lens of generator functions or simple processes which, when layered or combined, produce complex, unpredictable, and negative effects. And he argues that certain generator functions contribute to structurally increasing the probability of existential risks occurring. So in the context of climate change, this idea is often expressed using the term threat multiplier, which suggests that pre-existing risks will interact with warming in a way that makes them more dangerous. So you've probably heard this in impact debates about climate change. So this way of thinking is a little bit at odds with the sort of scenario-based approach that pervades many 1ACs, but it provides a helpful vocabulary for describing what we think of as structural threats. So consider an advantage or an impact argument that is centered around education. A common way to impact improvements in educational attainment is to focus on economic benefits and to say there are conflict risks from economic decline or losses in economic competitiveness from lower educational outcomes. But the thing is, that doesn't really get at the main way that educational attainment interacts with existential risk, which is that a society with lots of smarter people is stronger, more adaptive, more likely to learn from mistakes of the past, right? Like there's all kinds of ways in which that society is preferable. This is difficult to connect to a scenario in the traditional sense, but that is actually a feature, not a bug. A more educated population might not have voted for Trump. A more educated population might experience lower levels of poverty, reducing the kinds of social alienation that contribute to xenophobia and right-wing nationalism. A more educated population might be more likely to think critically about climate skepticism, building political momentum for avoiding ecological disasters. A more educated population might be more likely to produce, let's say, a genius investor who discovers a universal vaccine, or a genius political scientist who figures out how society can rid itself of weapons of mass destruction. So undereducation is thus a generator function that contributes to many different kinds of existential risks, including ones that we maybe can't even imagine. So to vote against such an impact because of impact events that mitigates the probability of one threat, such as climate change, would be nonsensical, because there are so many other possibilities, so many other ways in which that impact interacts with big tail end risks. An example that might be more likely to emerge on this topic is disinformation. Disinformation certainly connects to traditional impacts. So like spoofing of nuclear systems is one example of disinformation and can have very dangerous effects. But disinformation also has broader ramifications. Democracy works by translating what people want into decision-making by elected government officials. And when what people want is informed by ideas about the world that don't correspond to reality, that translates into government decisions that are based on inaccurate priors. So the harms of this can't necessarily be predicted in advance, but we can look back at history to get some idea of what this kind of distortion causes. So like, for example, would the Iraq War have happened if our epistemic commons remained healthy in the face of post 9/11 opportunistic securitization? Would ISIS have formed in the vacuum that followed US intervention? Would the trillions of dollars the US committed to that conflict have instead been spent on a robust welfare state that reduced social and economic dislocation? Would Iran have been able to exploit the instability to intervene in the Syrian civil war? Would Russia have gained military and operational confidence from its participation in that conflict? Obviously, those are all hypotheticals with no concrete or clear answers that anyone could say for sure. But what one can say is that the stakes of the most powerful nation on earth charting its foreign policy course based on reality instead of fantasy are massive. Those stakes are enormous. So this kind of explanation helps increase your uncertainty multiplier as well as your worst case multiplier. The range of threats that a generator function can cause is massive and terrifying, and the magnitude of the internal link is unknowable in advance, but could be quite high. So such broad-based interventions against existential risk might be more valuable than narrow interventions whose benefits are contingent on the truth of a series of mutually dependent internal link arguments. Sorry. So though the effect in any individual situation may not be decisive, the sheer number of situations in which mitigating an X-risk generator function may be beneficial makes it highly likely to be decisive in some number of contexts over time. So this sort of resembles the conjunctive fallacy argument that some teams try to use to like dismiss disads, but combining this frame with specific internal link mitigation and terminal impact arguments of your own can produce genuinely meaningful comparisons. Next, I want to talk briefly about time frame. I know I said that was a banned word, but it is a little bit more straightforward than the other categories. So invoking the speed of an impact isn't necessarily as prone or susceptible to replacing a nuanced explanation with something that is too vacuous or boilerplate. So some impacts are clearly faster than others, and this matters for obvious reasons. It is better to die later than sooner. Avoiding something imminent should be a higher priority than avoiding something far in the future, since we can find solutions to distant threats later down the line. This is sometimes called intervening actors. We know if we know that we're going to die soon from one impact, we should avoid that, knowing that there are possible solutions that can be generated further down the line for things that are later off. An earlier impact can also cause a later impact, but not the other way around. These questions all implicate the reasonable core the uncertainty multiplier, and the worst case multiplier. Urgent threats are worse than distant ones and have a lower probability of naturally resolving themselves. The key pitfall to avoid here is to not say that your impact is fast without drawing a comparison. You have to explain why your impact is faster than your opponent's, not just urgent and abstract. So that gets back to the discussion at the beginning. And it's always about faster than, not just fast. Next, and very important, is turning or subsuming the other side's impacts. When one side's impact includes the other side's, that is a good way for the judge to decide that the larger impact outweighs the smaller one without necessarily determining the absolute risk of either one. And this is easier to do if you're going for a generator function style impact, but it is certainly plausible and worth attempting regardless of what kind of impact you have. If you can argue that the other side's impact is included in yours, that is highly valuable. Last, proportionality to internal link. So we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, that your impact comparison should be as low on the internal link chain as possible. And impacts only matter insofar as they connect to an internal link that someone uniquely solves, which means that your impact description should be contextualized to your unique internal link. So let's take a scenario. Suppose you're AF against a process counter plan. The neg has conceded the case, but they're likely to win that they solve it because it's a process counter plan. So your best hope is some kind of mediocre, wishy-washy certainty argument. A typical 2AR will start by describing the impact in a vacuum, saying it is important and saying it is dropped. A better 2AR will describe the proportion of the conceded impact that is produced by uncertainty and compare that section of the impact to the neg's internal net benefit. So a helpful approach in this situation is to include linearity or an invisible brink argument, an uncertainty multiplier specific to an impact to a solvency deficit. So the counterplan might solve a lot of biodiversity, but given the complexity of the biosphere, how can we be sure that it is enough? The counterplan might solve a lot of AI research, but R&D is inherently probabilistic and expensive. So any increment of deficit might mean that the critical experiment is not conducted or the critical hire isn't made and innovation lapses. So are you willing to roll those dice for the sake of the net benefit is the question you should be posing to the judge. The way you describe your impact in the first place should synergize with this strategy on the counterplan page so that your speech has a coherent narrative about what thresholds are important. And finally, really, last subheader is concessions. We have avoided talking too much about debate conventions, but in a real debate, these are worth emphasizing, especially in final rebuttals. Conceded defense is one of the surest ways to reduce uncertainty or reduce worst case multipliers for your opponent's impacts or to increase the size or certainty of your own. If you have a conceded impact or there's conceded defense to your opponent's impact, it is always worth instructing the judge to give this fact significant weight in their evaluation. So concessions matter. Final thoughts. At bottom, there is no easy trick to good impact comparison. There's no one size fits all. This is how you should do it in every case, in every situation. This is how it works. But there are guidelines that can suggest good criteria that can be very meaningful when specifically applied. And everyone can do this at some level, but many debaters fall into the trap of using impact buzzwords that don't mean anything by themselves and crowd out substantive comparisons. So hopefully what these ideas have done have inspired you to think about new real-world, concrete, jargon-free ways to explain why your arguments are more important than your opponents and should be avoided at all costs, or that the judge should vote for you instead of the other team. Okay, questions? Maybe there are no questions.
Great. Okay. Can you explain, I feel like for certain impacts where it hasn't occurred, what is the best way to kind of deal with like that trade-off where it hasn't occurred, so there's like no basis for it, but like also like how do you argue for uncertainty? I feel like it's kind of hard to argue.
Yeah, great question. So I think that is where you want to make that uncertainty really, really scary, right? You want to be like, there is no basis for comparison because this has not occurred before. However, we have reason to believe, our set of internal link arguments are reasons to believe that it might happen in this case. And the very skepticism that you have about this impact should actually be inverted to make you more scared of what would occur if it does happen, right? So like the uncertainty of never having seen anything like this before should terrify you when it comes to the actuality of what could occur when this impact comes to pass, right? So like basically you want to speak directly to the judge's inherent skepticism and say you should flip it. Like you, instead of being so skeptical and so sanguine about this possibility because it hasn't occurred, you should be very nervous about the possibility. So a novel threat is one that we can't predict the effects of, and thus has the possibility to be much more catastrophic than anything we have seen before. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Someone in the chat DM'd me, what kind of comparison should you be making a dropped impact versus counterplane net benefit debate, like the process CP example you used? So dropped impact versus counterplane net benefit. I think what this means is they have dropped your impact, but they're going for a process counterplan. So that is where, you still have to win some solvency deficit, right? You have to, it is for your dropped impact to matter, you have to be winning some degree of a solvency deficit to the counterplan. Now, if your impact is totally conceded, that is where the risk of that solvency deficit can be potentially a little bit smaller. That the solvency deficit can be minuscule, but the impact is massive because it has been conceded. So you can be certain that we are all going to die for the following reasons if this impact happens. So that should make you very, very nervous about, allowing yourself to vote for something that, may appear at first glance to be sufficient to solve this impact, but may not be sufficient. And that's where some of the framing, issues like invisible threshold or ecological interconnectivity or, irrationality or any of the filters that we've talked about should play in to make the judge more scared of a minuscule risk of your impact than they would be of, the risk of the net benefit. I hope that answers that question. Other questions? Okay, if there are no other questions, you can go to your next elective. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. And thank you, LJ. Everyone give LJ a round of applause.
Are we gonna be able to see this recording? Like, can you send it out to us? Because like I
Yes.
know they're gonna send it out in a couple months, but like I'd like to be able to review it,
Yeah, I think that they'll be up very soon because Truth has been turning them around very fast. So it should be in the next couple days.
Oh, okay, cool. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you.